All right. Good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania, thank you all for joining us for tonight's virtual program as we commemorate what is the eve of the 212th birthday of President Abraham Lincoln. My name is Ashley Luskey. I am on the board of the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania, and I am also the Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Before I introduce tonight's guest speaker, I'd just like to tell you a brief snippet about who the Lincoln Fellowship of Pennsylvania is, what we do. We were, of course, created here in Gettysburg in 1938, and on every November 19th, since 1938, traditionally, we have held a commemorative ceremony in Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg to reflect upon the meaning of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that was delivered here November 19th, 1863. We host a keynote speaker, we have a wreath-laying ceremony, and we have a number of other traditional elements of the program as well. We also host the 100 Nights of Taps program, which some of you might have attended in the past. That is a program that usually runs between Memorial Day and Labor Day every summer, where every night we have a different bugler from around the country who comes and sounds taps in Soldiers National Cemetery. There is a very short ceremony each evening to, again, reflect upon the loss and legacy of those who fought here at Gettysburg for the Union. We also support Gettysburg National Military Park's Traveling Trunk Program, which is an educational program that sends out materials about Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln's legacy to schools across the country to help students become more educated about the importance that the 16th president had in our country. And we maintained the return visit statue of Abraham Lincoln here on Lincoln Square in Gettysburg next to the famous Will's house, where Abraham Lincoln stayed the night before he gave the Gettysburg Address. One of our other additional goals that we've been working hard at the Lincoln Fellowship to achieve is to improve upon our educational programming and outreach to try and reach broader audiences, to teach them about the lasting meaning and importance of the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's legacy. Last year, what seems like a lifetime ago now, we had a bunch of preschoolers from Gettysburg walk up to Lincoln Square to the return visit statue and sing happy birthday to the Lincoln statue, learn a little bit about President Lincoln's visit, and then enjoy some cupcakes courtesy of the Lincoln Fellowship. That was one of our new educational programs. Of course, the events of the past year have halted much of that programming, but we return here tonight to kick off what is hopefully going to be a more regular virtual series of programming to help, again, reach a broader audience and talk about broader issues connected with Abraham Lincoln and his legacy. So to kick off that educational programming for the year, we have with us tonight Associate Professor of American Studies, Jonathan White, who teaches at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. Jonathan White may be familiar to a lot of you all. He is a prolific scholar, has written widely about a large number of historical issues in the 19th century, about Lincoln, many works about Lincoln, but also about constitutional history and legal history. So he is well versed on the subject. And tonight we are going to be talking about the presidential election of 1864 and Abraham Lincoln, and specifically about John's 2014 book from UNC Press, Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Reelection of Abraham Lincoln. So John, thank you so much for joining us here tonight for this virtual commemoration and again to kick off this new series of educational programming. I know the last time that you and I spoke back in November, it was a very busy time of year for you with the election and speaking about elections in general. So I imagine that has only kept up. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not been quite as busy as it was in October and November, but I'm still talking a lot about the election of 64.
Sure. I think today, we have an understanding of how presidential elections in America work or are supposed to work, but they're very different in many regards in terms of the voting process from how things worked in the 19th century and particularly during the Civil War years. So if you could kind of get us started by giving us a brief overview of some of those key differences between how elections functioned in the 19th century and how they differ from current elections, or are in some ways, of course, many ways very similar. That would be great.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And in fact, to start us off, I'm going to show some slides, some images to everyone. Let's see here. And I think it can be helpful for seeing what the elections looked like back then to really get a sense of how different they were. And I'm going to start off actually with this. Can you see the ballots there?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got 4 ballots here. The one on the left is from Michigan. The other 3 are from Ohio. And if you look at them, and I know they're very small and people watching from home probably can't make out too many of the words, but if you look at the top of any of them, you'll see they all say union. So the one from Michigan on the left says for the union. The other ones say something like Ohio Union or Union presidential ticket. And the one on the right is actually in German. All of these ballots were printed at the local level by the political parties. So these were all Republican ballots that were made so that people could vote for Lincoln. If you were a Republican, you would go to a polling place and you would get Republican ballots. If you were a Democrat, you would go to the polling place and you would get Democratic ballots. And they would have different colors on them. You can see that some of these are pink or yellow or grayish brown. They might have different symbols on them. And what's really important about this is that there's no secrecy in how you vote in the 19th century. And that's something that's just so fundamentally different in the elections that they held then versus how we do it today. Today, when you go to vote, there's a ballot and it's printed or at least ordered by the government, and you get it. And it has all the different candidates on it from the different parties, and you choose who you're going to vote for on that ballot, and it's all done in secret. In the 19th century, you went to the polling place, you got a ballot from your party operative, you walked through the polling place, and then you cast it, and there's no secrecy. I'm going to show another image of ballots, and I came across these actually just a week ago. The one on the left, again, you can see a lot of symbolism. This is another Republican ballot. It's got the flags, patriotic symbols like the eagle. And on the right, you see a whole stack of them. This whole cache of ballots sold at auction, I think in 2013 for $8,000, which actually was a little bit of a bargain, only about $30 each.
That sounds like it.
Now, here's an image you can see of a polling place in New York. And if you look really closely, you can see the booth on the left says Union. The booth on the right looks like it probably says Friends of the Democrats. You can kind of see DEM. And so if you were a voter back then, you would go to the polling place and you would go to the booth or the party workers who were from your party, and they would hand you a ballot. And again, it has all the colors on it. It has the symbols on it. So everyone can see who you're going to vote for because you get it from a party operative. You're walking through the crowd with the ballot in your hand. They can see what color it is. And then you go to vote. And this is an image from 5 Points in Manhattan, and it's inside of a polling place. If you look really closely at the center of the image, just beyond the man who kind of looks like a police officer, looks like he's holding a baton, you'll see the ballot boxes, and you'll notice that they are glass bowls. And so there's no secrecy from the moment you get your ballot until you deposit it in a glass bowl. And as a consequence, there could be a lot of violence surrounding elections. And so this is the last image I'll show here for now, where, you know, you're outside in the polling place and people can see how it is you're voting, and fights are going to break out. There's going to be intimidation where people might try to persuade another person forcibly not to vote a certain way. Let's say you're a clerk in a store and your boss knows how you're going to vote, or you know your boss wants you to vote a different way. You might choose not to vote the way you want to vote because you don't want to lose your job. And so I'll stop sharing there. I think it's really key for people today to realize just how different elections were, in large part because the parties are involved in the printing and distribution of the ballots, and there's no secrecy in how you do it. So there's a lot of room for violence and intimidation.
Sure. And of course, that fact is fundamental to your work in this book about the election of 1864. Obviously, the secrecy of the vote, the protection of the privacy of the vote is something that's so cherished today that I think we've probably always assumed it's been kind of like that. But obviously, it wasn't. Now, in the election of 1864, that election has come to be celebrated for good reason, and widely known for a few key points. Number one, it's been celebrated as the first time that American soldiers were allowed to vote in the field, which is a huge, advancement, a step of progress. But number two, it's been regarded as just this explosion of the democratic process, the purity of the democratic process that was expanded and brought to soldiers in the field. And number three, that through that expansion of the democratic process, it seems to have revealed, at least by simple statistics, that there was this radical transformation that occurred amongst Union soldiers between 1861, or 1860 rather, and 1864, that the war has transformed them almost universally into diehard Lincoln lovers, diehard supporters of republicanism, diehard supporters of emancipation. And we get a lot of those assumptions from this amazing statistic that 78% of soldier votes were cast for Lincoln. So it seems to suggest that all of those things might be true. But you tell us a much more complicated story with a lot more nuances to it. Can you explain, first of all, what your methodology was in kind of unpacking what that 78% really means and how that number really mischaracterizes those beliefs in this radical Republican transformation of the Army?
Sure. And before I do that, I'll throw in one other significant aspect of the election, if I may, and that is that it happened at all. That the nation was in the middle of this great civil war. You've got millions of men who are away from home, away from their election districts, going to fight. And, Democrats were afraid that Lincoln would either cancel the election or not abide by the result if he lost. Lincoln's response was, hey, I'm fighting this war to maintain small r Republican government. And so the last thing he would do is either cancel the election or not abide by the result. But I think having the election itself is really remarkable.
Sure.
In terms of the soldier vote, so at the beginning of the Civil War, there was only one state in the nation that allowed soldiers to vote, and that was Pennsylvania, where you are and my home state. And Pennsylvania's law actually went all the way back to the War of 1812. And Pennsylvania and New Jersey had enfranchised soldiers during the War of 1812. New Jersey repealed its law. And then by the time the Civil War comes around, Pennsylvania is the only one that allows soldiers to vote. And soldiers from Pennsylvania voted in October of 1861. There was a tremendous amount of fraud in those elections. There was one regiment from Philadelphia that I think had 900 votes for, I think, the Republican candidate, even though there were about 100 men in the regiment who were qualified from Philadelphia to vote. So in 1862, the state Supreme Court strikes down the right of soldiers to vote away from home. And the Republicans lose significantly in the 1862 elections. And they come to realize the reason they aren't winning is that a lot of Republicans, they think, have gone off and joined the Army, while Democratic voters have stayed home to vote. And so there's this big push from 1862 to 64 to enfranchise soldiers. And by 1864, 19 northern states have passed laws that let them vote either in the field or by mail. And we can talk about that more down the road. About 156,000 soldiers voted in the field. And soldiers from 4 states sent their ballots home. And so we don't know exactly how they voted. But among those of those 156,000 soldiers, as you said, about 78% cast their votes for Lincoln. And most people just thought, well, clearly they adopted emancipation as a war aim. Clearly they supported Lincoln's reelection. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And so I looked at a number of different kind of records that you wouldn't necessarily look at when you're thinking about the political history of elections. So I looked at court-martial records at the National Archives and found soldiers who speak out against Lincoln, speak out against emancipation, say they're going to vote for McClellan, and they get court-martialed for it. They get dismissed from the service for speaking in this way. Now, these are guys who are citizens, and they think, well, I have a First Amendment right to speak my mind on politics. And they don't realize that when they become soldiers, they become governed by the Articles of War, and that they are not allowed to criticize the president. And so when they criticize the president or when they criticize his policies, they get punished. And one of the things I suggest in the book is that, yes, 78% of the soldiers who voted for Lincoln. But what about the men who chose not to vote? We need to think about what that meant for them. And I found a lot of Democrats who wrote home and said they weren't going to vote. They didn't feel like they could vote because they might get punished for doing so. Or for a number of them, they want to vote for George McClellan, who's the Democratic nominee for president, because he's a pro-war Democrat. He's also pro-slavery, but he's pro-war. But the Democratic Party in 1864 had put him with a running mate who was a peace Democrat. And they put him on a platform that called it the War a Failure. And so I think there were a lot of Democrats in the Army who want to vote Democratic, but they can't vote for a party that calls their effort in the war, in the battlefield of failure. Or what if George McClellan dies? And I found several soldiers who write about this. If he dies, a Copperhead becomes president, a Copperhead who doesn't believe in what they're fighting for and is maybe willing to let the South go in peace. And so I think these are just some of the reasons. There's a whole host of reasons. And I found these in part by looking at letters and diaries, newspaper editorials, election returns at state archives like in Harrisburg and other places. And then these court-martial records, which had never been utilized really for this purpose. And sort of bringing these kind of sources together enabled me, I think, to see a different story than the one that had been traditionally understood for 150 years before that.
Sure. And, you made an important point in your book that of the soldiers who did vote, we can't necessarily take their votes as being all for something, but rather against the platform of the Copperheads and against, the peace Democrats. So maybe they held their noses and they voted, not because they were true Republicans or permanent Republicans,
right?
Kind of temporary Republicans, because they, as you said, could not bring themselves to vote for a party that, called the war a failure and that did have a peace Democrat as the running mate.
And to add to that, what's really interesting is if you look at some of their letters over the course of time, you see soldiers wrestling with these issues and changing their minds. Lincoln was convinced he was going to lose in August of 1864. He writes his very famous blind memo where he says he'll work with the Democrat who wins to save the Union. He invites Frederick Douglass to come meet at the White House to try to strategize to free as many slaves as possible before he's out of office. Lincoln is convinced he's going to lose. And the reason is that the war was going really badly between the spring of 1864 and then September, when Atlanta finally falls to William Tecumseh Sherman. During that period, if you look at soldiers writing from the field, many of them are talking about how disheartened they are. Just like voters in the North are disheartened and are thinking about throwing Lincoln out of office, there are Union soldiers who say, I can't fight for this to continue, or I can't vote for this to continue. And they're ready to vote for Lincoln to be out of office. But when things take a turn for the better in September with the capture of Atlanta, with Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, with the capture of Mobile Bay, their hopes are buoyed in the same way that the Northern electorate is. And I think a lot of these guys, they're leaning against Lincoln in the spring and summer. They come over in favor of him as the best way to win the war by November.
Sure. Yeah. And of course that puts a kind of a cautionary flag up in the air for people who are lured in by the appeal of Gettysburg as being the high tide of the Confederacy, and everything was, kind of downhill for the Confederates, and that, Union victory was assured in the summer of 1863. Absolutely, of course, was not the case. And
Right.
you're right. Those brutal campaigns that occur throughout the spring and summer of 64, the Overland Campaign, of course, standing out to me. It does convince so many soldiers that they're not in this for the long haul anymore. And you see those contingencies playing out in the battlefield. The political, situation is not a straight line at any point during the war. And so much of it does rest upon those Union victories in the early fall of 64.
Yeah.
The other statistic that I always think is interesting too, in reflecting on what you highlight with your book, is the number of soldiers, the percentage of soldiers who chose not to vote. And you've talked about them and some of the reasons why they didn't vote. That's a good 20% of them, correct?
Yeah, and I should say too, I was very conservative in that estimate. So I estimate what I did was I went to the National Archives. Well, I should say first, I found as many returns for regiments as I could find, and I have all these sort of statistics in appendices in the back so that people can kind of see how I came up with it. So I started by finding as many regiments as I could that voted on Election Day. And then I went to the National Archives and I pulled the morning reports for as many of these regiments as I could find to see how many men were present on Election Day. And then what I did with the morning reports was I used a statistical analysis that was published in 1869 to try to figure out, okay, how many of these men are probably voting age? And so I took the number present on Election Day, and then I factored in, using the statistical source from 1869, how many were probably 21, because you had to be 21 then, not 18, and then compared it with the election returns. And so I estimate that the voting turnout was about 80%. Now, the reason I think that I'm too conservative there is, using this methodology, there were some regiments that were over 100% voter turnout. And so if I had to be honest, and maybe I should have put this in the book because it would have made an even stronger case. I won't guesstimate, I guess, but I think the voter turnout was significantly less than 80%. But I knew I was challenging the way everyone thinks about this, and I knew I'd get pushback from historians. So I tried to be as conservative as I could be in making the case, so I wouldn't be accused of overstating it.
Sure.
Of
course, so, in working with those hard numbers, let me just say you do something that a lot of historians are terrified of, because we enter history because we don't like numbers except for dates. Myself, right. You did the hard work of crunching those numbers and factoring in those statistics, which obviously is so crucial for the work that you're doing.
And I will say, I've gotten pushback from some historians who say, well, 80%, even if it is 80%, that's a really high voter turnout. Mm-hmm. And I'll concede that it is, except I'll kind of make this exception. It was never easier in the 19th century for a man to vote than on the election of 1864. Because if you were a rural farmer in the 1850s or 60s, you might have to walk miles to vote. And so to vote it could take a full day to make that effort. In 1864, you just had to walk down your company street to outside of your captain's tent and vote. It was a very short, very quick process. And so I think that for men to choose not to vote under those circumstances, they were making a conscious decision not to vote in most cases.
Sure. Yeah, and again, that's another critical factor here in kind of doing the logistical thinking of what goes into actually casting a vote, right. Especially now versus then, but also, between those two circumstances that you just compared, it does seem very easy. So it does seem like obviously a political choice to not cast your vote. Now, you brought up, of course, the Articles of War and what was allowed and what wasn't allowed in terms of speaking out against the president. Obviously, politics were a big focus of conversation around the campfire, between, men, waiting around camp, in between battles on the march, et cetera, et cetera. but there were certain guidelines. So can you kind of walk us through where usually those lines stood in terms of what you could say and when you would cross a line? And by 1864, have those guidelines become that much more rigid specifically because of this election?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Articles of War go back decades before. I don't recall exactly, but I think the ones that were in place by 1861, I think had been generally in place since around 1805, but don't quote me on that. So they've been around for a long time. And again, they prohibit things like criticizing the president and so forth. And so soldiers learned this in a couple of different ways. Now, the Articles of War were supposed to be read by the officers to their men somewhat regularly. That didn't always happen. And a lot of these guys who get court-martialed say, hey, the Articles of War were never read in our regiment. I didn't know that this is what I was bound to. But, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Right. And so the court-martials of men who criticize emancipation are taking place right after Lincoln issues the preliminary proclamation, September, October, November of 62, and then again after the final Emancipation Proclamation in January of 63. And the thing about it is a lot of times these punishments were very public. So if you violate the Articles of War, you're going to be punished in a way that your comrades are going to see. You may have your name and your offense published in a newspaper. You may have it circulated in camp, or you may even be punished in a way that's physical in front of people. So there are cases, and some of these are very famous, like if a guy gets drunk and they have to wear a barrel that says like, I'm a drunkard or something. Right. So, those kind of things. And there's actually cartoons that survive from the Civil War that show men like that. But they also did that with men who criticized Lincoln. So there were cases where guys said bad things about Lincoln, and they then had to wear a placard, and it would say, I said such and such about Lincoln. And they're standing in camp and everyone sees it. I mean, I found accounts where I read the court-martial, and then I would go and look through the letters and diaries of men from the regiment and find them writing about it, like so-and-so had this happen. And so then everyone at home finds out, because if it's in the letter, then it's found out at home and your community knows. And what I suggest in the book is that this was a top-down effort on the part of Lincoln and the War Department to teach the soldiers that they had to support emancipation, or if they were not going to support emancipation, they needed to keep it to themselves. And it's funny the language you used about sort of like, where was the line drawn? Because sometimes those lines were really quite literal. So in the lead up to the election of 1864, a number of regiments had their Republican officers come forward and say, okay, everyone's in a line. If you're going to vote Lincoln, if you're going to vote Republican, take a step forward. And so if you stepped forward, you might get furloughed home to vote if your state hasn't permitted soldiers to vote. If you don't step forward, soldiers were very concerned that they would get the worst duty or the most dangerous duty. I found one guy from Vermont who I write about extensively in the book who said, I'll be as black as the D. And then he put in a line, probably he was, darky is what he was saying, but he was saying, and that was meaning a black Republican. So he stepped forward when his officer said this, and his view was, hey, if it gets me home, I'll tell him I'm going to vote Republican. And of course he would have to then, because there's no secret ballot. He was willing to do that rather than face the potential consequences of not stepping forward to that line and admitting that he was a Democrat, which he really was.
Right. Right. Now, in terms of the composition of the Army in 1864, that has a lot to do with that 78% number as well. There's obviously soldier choice. There's some intimidation and coercion going on, and we can get into more of that after this. But can you talk a little bit about how the composition of the Army has changed over the course of the war, and how that also plays into that 78% number that's so often flaunted around?
Yeah, one of the things I did, and again, I have an appendix on this, all the numbers, I created an appendix or a set of tables. One of the numbers that has really perplexed historians of the Civil War is the percentage of soldiers who reenlisted. in 1864. So Joe Gladar said it was at 6% in his book from the 90s. And then Jim McPherson in For Cause and Comrades said it was more than 50%. There's a big difference there between 6 and more than 50. And what I did, and I wanted to be, again, very careful with this. So we have a mutual friend, I think, Tim Orr, who teaches 20 minutes away from me at Old Dominion University. And I pulled out the War Department reports from around the time of where they were reporting on the reenlistments. And he and I looked at, all the different troops that were levied at different periods of the war. And I wanted to know, who is it who was eligible to reenlist? And so Tim really helped me understand, okay, these groups were eligible to reenlist and these were not. And I was able to figure out that the number was greater than 6%, less than 50. I haven't looked at it actually in years, and I forget what the exact number is. But what I suggest in the book is there were a lot of men who were eligible to reenlist in 1864 who chose to go home. They chose not to fight. Now, this is not to say that all of them were Democrats who wanted to vote for McClellan and didn't want to vote for Lincoln. There were certainly Republicans who went home as well. But I do think that there were a fair number of Democrats who left the Army before November 1864. And when we think about there are some scholars who argue that Union soldiers had become Republicans and abolitionists as early as 1861. And I think that's misreading of the evidence. And I think if we take into account the soldiers who leave, if they had stayed in the Army, that 78% would have been even less.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And of course, there is still, even those who vote for emancipation, a big difference between being for emancipation and then for abolition, or being an abolitionist outright. And 19th century Americans, of course, knew that distinction much more clearly than I think, again, 21st century Americans do. But yeah, that's a strong claim, especially to make by that early in the war, and even later in the war as well. I want to go back to the point about the Articles of War and kind of these ideas of free speech. So Republicans obviously championed free speech as, this is a right and it's got to be preserved. It's got to be protected. It's part of, this great, democratic government, the last best hope of democracy, that the Union is fighting to protect. How did Republicans from Lincoln on down, through his cabinet, through Republican officers who are intimidating and kind of coercing soldiers into voting for Lincoln in camp, how did they kind of reconcile those two competing notions that you have to be able to have free speech and speak your mind about politics in order to, render the democratic process pure? But on the other hand, in order to win a war, do you have to suppress free speech or coerce people into voting a certain way, and in that way kind of tainting the democratic process? How did they reconcile that? Did you find that in your work?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, like, one of the great things about the election of 64 is that it happened, right? But at the same time, your point is exactly right. There was a lot of intimidation, a lot of suppression in the border states among civilian voters and in the field. And in fact, a number of Democratic soldiers complain that they can't get Democratic literature, that Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, just won't allow pamphlets to get sent. Republican pamphlets are fine. They can circulate among the troops. Democratic pamphlets can't. Democratic ballots often don't get to the troops. And in fact, there was a congressman named Samuel Cox of Ohio, and he complained that when he went to try to electioneer among the troops, that he was not allowed in, and he believed that the ballots he tried to distribute to the soldiers were destroyed before they got to the soldiers. And in fact, I found accounts written by Republican soldiers who talked about Democrats coming to electioneer, and then they said, as soon as they left, we destroyed the ballots. And so there is a lot of this sort of chicanery going on, and it's hard for Democrats to vote in the field, in part because of the intimidation we talked about earlier, and in part because they can't always get ballots or can't get literature to campaign. And if they wrote, it was very common for soldiers to write for newspapers and sort of tell the folks at home what's going on. Plenty of them got court-martialed or got in trouble for writing to Democratic newspapers. And so that sort of free speech, it just wasn't as free as we might like to think it was. Now, I think I would tend to put a lot of the blame on Stanton at the point of the election of 1864. Lincoln professed to want a free and fair election. In fact, there's a diary of an election commissioner from Pennsylvania who went down to the South, and the diary was published, I think, about 20 or 30 years ago in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. His name was David McKelvey, and he recorded in his diary about meeting Lincoln, and Lincoln says, play fair, let the boys vote the way they want to vote. And so Lincoln professed to want a fair election, and I think to a large extent he did. But he also did know that there were some things going on that maybe shouldn't have been, and I think he was willing to let that slide.
Right. Which of course exposes, the messiness of democracy to begin with, that you get these competing factors. And it reminds me, Pete Carmichael and I were talking with Andy Lang a couple weeks ago on Finding the Source, our program through CWI that we run. And we were talking about his new book about American exceptionalism during the 19th century. And your book, and particularly this part of the discussion, kind of reminds me of that there is the idea of exceptionalism, that both sides, North and South, went to war to try to protect very different notions of what exceptionalism means to them, and the ferocity with which they thought that they had to protect exceptionalism and democracy as they interpreted democracy and liberty to mean. That also justified the temporary suppression of key facets of democracy in order to achieve a longer term goal of making sure that their version of democracy and exceptionalism lived, and not the competing one that was the threat.
Yeah, what you just said makes me think of Lincoln's message to Congress in special session on July 4th, 1861, where he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but should I let all the laws but one fail to save that one law? And in that case, he's talking about the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. But the broader point is, I think, what you're getting at, that you maybe break some norms or some laws in order to preserve. The way they thought of it was you do some of that in order to preserve the bigger system as a whole. Right.
Yeah. And we had also talked about whether, during Reconstruction, that moderate policies that ultimately won out, whether a harsher policy would have secured a longer term peace or a quicker peace and civil rights in the South. And I guess perhaps some of that same reasoning could have gone into what Lincoln and Republicans were thinking, was that, this is the surest way to get a victory, is to help ensure a Lincoln victory, a Republican victory, the preservation of the Union, and just get the deal over with, and then try to return to, something that we agreed upon before as being the democratic process of voting.
So I'm writing a history of Black visitors to the Lincoln White House right now. Yeah. And in the spring of 1864, 3 different delegations of African Americans came to meet with Lincoln. One were elite, wealthy Creoles from Louisiana. There was just 2 men there, 6 men from North Carolina, some who had been born free, some who had been enslaved, and then another group that was from Virginia and other places. And when the first group from Louisiana came to meet with Lincoln, they said, we should have the right to vote. And Lincoln's response was, it's not, as president, I can't just give you the right to vote, and I can't really support it. Like he said, in principle, I support you having the right to vote, but I can't do anything about it unless it helps to win the war. And through conversations with him, and then this group from North Carolina a month later comes, what the African American delegations begin to argue is the best way to win the war and secure the peace is by giving us the right to vote. because you've got all these disloyal traitors in the Confederacy. If they come back into the Union and can vote, they're going to overturn Republican policies and emancipation and so forth. If you give black men the right to vote, it's actually a way to secure democracy. And the argument they made was, we're the most loyal people in the country. You're not going to find any black Confederates out there.
Right.
And so yeah, it's really interesting how these debates about the meaning of suffrage and who should exercise it and why are coming up in so many different ways during the Civil War. Soldiers are enfranchised because they're the ones who are sacrificing for the nation. They, of all people, should be allowed to vote. Black men are saying, give us the ballot and we can help uphold the Union and Republican institutions. So yeah, I just thought of that when you were talking. I haven't read Andy's book yet. I need to.
Yeah.
But I thought of that when you were talking about Reconstruction.
Yeah. No, it's very good. I would definitely recommend it. And, I'm glad that you brought up that point about how, voting being linked to, loyalty and citizenship, good citizenry. You make that point in your book that soldiers voting during the war in the field it helps to buoy African Americans' arguments in the post-war years to justify their right to vote, because they, were soldiers. Service equals sacrifice equals, it should equal citizenship. It should equal suffrage. All of those things are intertwined, again, in a way that I think often gets lost. We think of, what goes on amongst white soldiers and white voters during the war as being entirely separate from what goes on with the struggle for black suffrage in the post-war years. But you found a direct connection there. And the other interesting point that I thought you brought up was that Union deserters were stripped of some of their rights of suffrage. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in the immediate actually, it's even right before the end of the war. It's March of 1865. Congress passes a law that strips deserters of their citizenship rights. Yeah. And what's really funny about that is that the rights of citizenship were not yet defined in 1865, what it meant to be a U.S. citizen, and who could even be a citizen at that point, other than things like the Dred Scott decision. And so Congress passes this law that says deserters who don't come back to the Army are going to lose their rights of citizenship. And people just start to say, well, clearly that means the right to vote. But here's the thing. Under Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, Congress doesn't have any jurisdiction over the right to vote. That's controlled at the state level. And so what begins to happen is that states begin to pass laws essentially enforcing this law of Congress, because states are the ones who control citizenship. And so then they pass laws disfranchising the deserters from those states. And this federal law from 1865, I have a whole chapter on it in the book. This federal law stayed on the books until 1957. There was a deserter in Morocco in 1944 during World War II. His name was, I think, Alfred Trop. And he deserted from Morocco and from his army base, and he's kind of making his way through Morocco, and he doesn't have any money or food or anything, and he decides, okay, this is a bad idea, and he turns back, and he gets court-martialed and dishonorably discharged from the army. About 7-8 years later, he applies for a passport, and the State Department says, no, you've lost your citizenship because you deserted. And ultimately, in 1957, in a case called Trop versus Dulles, the Supreme Court says it's unconstitutional to take away a person's citizenship rights. And that's one of the most important cases in 20th century jurisprudence. And it's rooted in this law from 1865 about deserters losing the right to vote.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I had no idea that law was, in effect that long.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely wild. I want to, since we have about 15 minutes left or so, encourage people who are watching to please send in any questions that you might have for John, any comments as well. We encourage you to get involved in the conversation, especially, at this point, now that we've gone through a bunch of the main points in his book. And as you all maybe generate some questions and think of some comments in ways to participate in the conversation, I kind of want to, again, I'm so intrigued by this idea of, the silencing of political dissent amongst soldiers in the field. And I'm curious as to, what the public outrage might have been about that, even amongst Republicans. I mean, was there any concern that this was going to set a precedent for down the road in terms of, well, if the tables were turned and, we were shut down, that would, really be detrimental to everybody's, democratic rights. Was there public outrage about that, or are you seeing it more in kind of the individual, lamenting and grief, as much as soldiers could be open about that when
Right.
right home?
There was most of what I found is sort of in those private writings by Democratic soldiers. I found plenty of Republican soldiers who were perfectly fine with it. And I remember one letter I found at the New York Historical Society years ago of a man, a soldier from Rhode Island, who said that free speech and habeas corpus, or free speech should be gotten rid of like habeas corpus. I mean, from his perspective, like, this is a good thing. These Democrats are disloyal, they're traitors, and so their speech should not be protected. And one of the things we have to remember is that, that sort of suppression that I unearthed in the Army is very famously going on with various people in the North. I mean, the most famous instance would be Clement Vallandigham, who's a former congressman who goes back to Ohio in the spring of 1863, gives some speeches, and gets arrested and tried before a military court for disloyal speech. And most, Democrats decry it, and they have massive rallies in Columbus, Ohio, and Albany, New York, and Philadelphia to protest it. And the Democrats in Ohio and Pennsylvania write planks in their platform saying how Lincoln is trampling on the rights of American citizens, and in this case, a former congressman. But Republicans are fine with it. They see Vallandigham as a traitor, and so they don't think his speech should be protected. And it's important to remember too, today we think very highly of the First Amendment, but in the 19th century, the First Amendment, Democrats in the 1860s are pointing to the First Amendment, saying this right should be protected. But it was not absolute, and it was not seen as binding the states. And so throughout the antebellum period, especially after the 1830s, Southern states are banning abolitionist speech. So they're used to the banning of speech in certain cases. And it's not until 1919 that the Supreme Court finally hears a free speech case. So it's really a long time after the Civil War that free speech begins to be seen as something that could be protected by the courts. And I should point out, in the three cases in 1919, Schenck, Abrams, and Debs, the Supreme Court says no when people make free speech claims. So it's really not until the 20s and 30s and beyond that speech is protected by the Supreme Court. Yeah,
another fundamental difference when we're looking at, again, I think it's tempting to always try to compare apples and oranges between present day and the past. But of course, these specific contexts are so important to understanding how and why 19th century Americans might have said, oh yeah, we can deal with that, even though to us it flies, in the face of everything we believe and seems utterly hypocritical and against democracy. They're seeing through different lenses and different interpretations, as well as different legal frameworks.
Right.
We do have some questions. So a logistical questions: how were soldiers' votes sent home from the front? What was the process?
Oh, it's a great question. So 19 states enfranchised soldiers. As far as I can tell, not all of them collected votes. So Nevada became a state on Halloween in 1864. Lincoln really wanted those electoral votes from Nevada. There were 3 of them. And as far as I can tell, votes from Nevada weren't cast or counted. Out of the 19, 15 states had collection of voting in the field, and 4 states had what we would today call absentee voting or mail-in voting, so they sent them home. So New York, Connecticut, West Virginia, and now I'm blanking on the 4th, mailed their ballots home. New York, Connecticut, West Virginia, it'll come to me. At any rate, so for the 15 who had the voting in the field, the way it worked differently. So some states had the governor appoint people, official state operatives to go and collect the ballots. Others, like New York, what they did, they had state agents go and try to sort of what we would today, I guess, call ballot harvesting and collect a lot of ballots and send them home in trunks. In some cases, soldiers could just mail them home themselves, and they would do it with different envelopes in the same way that today we have that, you vote on your ballot, you fold it up, you put it in an envelope, you sign it, you put it in another envelope. They had forms and multiple envelopes in some cases like that. In Pennsylvania, it was the governor who appointed election commissioners, and they just went around trying to find as many troops as they could and collect their ballots that way. The New York guys, the state agents, got in a lot of trouble. So the governor of New York was Horatio Seymour. He's a Democrat. He only sends Democrats to go collect the ballots. He allegedly said to the New York Secretary of State, Chauncey Depew, hey, do you want to work and send me some Republicans and we'll send them all? And Chauncey Depew didn't work with him. So the governor just sends Democratic state agents to go collect the ballots. There were two guys in Baltimore who were found stuffing ballots, and they were just making up soldiers' names and signing the affidavits. And it's believed that they may have sent as many as 8,000 or 10,000 ballots back to New York that were just totally fraudulent. And I'll show a cartoon here. Let me see. I'll show a cartoon from 1864 that will give you a sense of how this was viewed by the voters in the North. And this one's called How the Copperheads Obtained Their Votes. There we go. And so you can see here, you've got two Democratic operatives who are at the graves of Union soldiers. You can see the ghost of the soldier hovering over them with his hands up. And then on the gravestone, it says, killed in the war for the Union. And this was done after these guys in Baltimore were captured or were arrested, making fraudulent votes for the Democratic candidate, George McClellan. The two guys in Baltimore were tried before a military tribunal. The judge advocate in that case said that they should be executed. They were found guilty. I think they got life in prison, although they were let out of prison a few years later. Three were then arrested for the same charge in Washington, D.C., also tried before a military tribunal. They got better lawyers and they were acquitted. Although Secretary Stanton believed that they were guilty. For the voting in the field, I'll show just a couple images here. This is one that shows men gathered around. There's a proclamation hanging on a tree, and you can see them in the foreground on the right-hand side discussing the election. Mm-hmm. In this one, this is supposed to be General Sheridan voting, but I don't think it really looks like him. This is one that this is actually what I use on the front cover of the book. When they voted in the field, they used whatever they could find. And so they often made their own ballots out of scraps of paper that they had if they couldn't get official type ballots from the parties. And so here they are collecting ballots on what looks like a whiskey barrel. And then this is probably the most famous image of the soldier vote of 1864. This is of Pennsylvania soldiers voting in the congressional election in October. And you can see they've set up outside the captain's tent, and they put a table with a flag over it, and the men are just lined up getting ready to cast their votes. And they would do it, they could do it into a cigar box or whatever they had available is what they would use.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I was wondering if there was some fraud that could have occurred along the way between the transfer of the votes from in camp to the actual place where they're collected. And it sounds like, there is definitely the window of opportunity was there.
There was. The irony is that the Democrats generally opposed allowing soldiers to vote. And one of the main arguments they used was that it would lead to fraud. And then it was Democrats who in 64 got caught in Baltimore and probably in Washington too, actually stuffing just crates full of ballots and sending them home. And, there's no voter registration in that era. That's going to come in the years immediately after the Civil War when states are going to begin to do that. So when the ballots get sent home, if you send it to a major metropolitan area, the way you would normally be held accountable to know that you're a legal voter is you would go and vote, and people there would say, yeah, I know him. He lives there. He's 21. He's a naturalized citizen. He can vote. But if you're just sending huge boxes full home. There's no way to really keep tabs.
Right.
And the other thing I'll say about the logistics of it, some of the votes didn't make it home in time. So the voting turnout for Michigan is really low because the ballots that were collected in the field took a long time to get back, and they just didn't count.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We have a question, I guess a more personal question, about what drew you to researching and writing about this particular topic. And I know this was something that we had talked about back in November, but I always think it's interesting to give people an idea to kind of humanize the historian behind the scholarship. Yeah,
well, thank you for whoever asked that question. So I dedicated this book. I won't try. I dedicated it to Mark Neely, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, retired from Penn State. And he came to Penn State when I was a sophomore, and I got to take a couple classes with him. And my senior year, I wanted to do an independent study with him. And so one day I went to his office and I said, "Can I do an independent study with you?" And he said, "Sure. What do you want to write about?" And I told him my idea. And he said, "No, that's not a good idea. Come back in a week." And so I came back a week later, and he gave me 3 ideas of things I could do from the middle of nowhere in State College, Pennsylvania. One of them was to look at Eastern Tennessee Unionists, because Penn State has some sort of microfilm collection that would have been helpful for that. One of them was the soldier vote of 1864. And I honestly don't have a clue what the third one was. I just can't remember from 21 years ago. This was the fall of 2000 when I asked him to do this. It was the first year I was old enough to vote in a presidential election, so I was interested in this sort of thing. And the only book that had ever been written on soldiers voting had been done by a veteran in 1915, so that it was really ripe for a fresh look. What I didn't know at the time was that Mark was planning to do his own work on the soldier vote and include a chapter on it in a book he wrote called The Union Divided back around 2002. But instead, he very graciously gave the topic to me. And so I wrote a paper for him in the spring of 2001 on soldiers from Pennsylvania voting. And then I went to graduate school at the University of Maryland, and I did my master's thesis on soldiers voting. But my professors there very wisely would not allow me to do my dissertation on it. They said, "You got to branch out and do something else. You can't just be the soldier vote guy." So I published 2 articles on the soldier vote out of my master's thesis. Actually, the third is going to come out with LSU Press later this year. It takes a long time sometimes. So I moved away from the soldier vote for my dissertation. And then in 2008, I gave a talk at the Society of Civil War Historians Conference in Philadelphia. And Mike Parrish came up to me afterwards and he said, "Hi, I'm Mike Parrish. Here's my card. Here's my cell phone number. I want to publish your book." And I thought, great.
That's
and
great.
So I should clarify. It's actually this one's LSU Press, not UNC.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
So 15 years after starting it, this book came out in 2014, and it was really a thrill to be able to dedicate it to Mark. Mark, when he teaches students, he tries to teach them to challenge the reigning paradigms. Mm-hmm. So you think about what is the received wisdom that everyone thinks is true about something, and then how can you try to maybe show that it's not actually what people think? And so that's what I tried to do in this book, and that's why I wanted to dedicate it to him. And that's how it got started.
Sure. That's a great story. What a journey. Yeah. And certainly, Mark's works are still foundational, I think, for understanding political history, but also, the paradigm shifts that he has helped to institutionalize in the field. I'm curious, we have another question. What percentage of the total vote did come from soldiers?
Great question. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I want to say it was only about 6% of the total vote. So Lincoln wins about 2.2 million votes. McClellan, I think, wins about 1.8 million votes. I'm going from memory here. And then 156,000 soldiers voted in the field. Mm-hmm. And then 4 states had soldiers go home. And then there were some soldiers who were sent home to vote, even if they were from states that allowed soldiers to vote. And the reason they did that with like Pennsylvania and Indiana, Lincoln was Lincoln and Stanton were worried that those states would lose that the Republicans would lose the home vote and win the soldier vote, and then it would look like it was a bayonet vote that carried those states.
Right.
So the War Department sent home thousands of soldiers from states that did permit soldiers to vote in order to have them counted in the home vote. But ultimately, I think it's probably about 6%, but I may be wrong about that. I can't do the math quite in my head. But related to that, one of the reasons I think there's a couple of reasons people hadn't studied the soldier vote between 1915 and when I did my book. One of them is I think people just thought the story was straightforward. Like 80% voted for Lincoln, end of story. They didn't want to look into more of what that might mean. The other reason I think is that the soldier vote didn't change the outcome of very many elections. Right. We don't know how New York and Connecticut soldiers voted because they mailed their ballots home. But it's very likely that New York and Connecticut soldiers changed those elections to go for Lincoln. But the most important election that soldiers participated in was actually in October of '64 in Maryland. Maryland had a constitution that was proposed to the voters for ratification in October of '64 that would end slavery in Maryland. Now, here's what was really weird about this constitution. The constitution would give soldiers the right to vote if it were ratified. The referendum was held on October 12th and 13th, 1864, and the governor of Maryland decided, you know what, we're going to let soldiers vote in the ratification of this Constitution, even though they are not yet authorized to vote because the Constitution hasn't been ratified yet. And the home vote went against the Constitution, and the soldier vote was strong enough in favor of it that it actually led the Constitution to be passed and ratified. And slaveholders in Maryland sued, and they took it up to the highest court in Maryland. And the Court of Appeals in Maryland said, no, we're going to count the soldier vote. And Lincoln was perfectly happy to have emancipation happen. And so he didn't do anything to, rightfully so, to try to stop it. But it was very controversial that soldiers were enfranchised by a constitution that was not yet the law of the state.
Sure. Yeah. And, you bring that up in your book, too, is that people get so focused on presidential elections, they forget about other elections that are happening, state and congressional elections, and what that can tell us about how political currents are leaning, but also about these other issues that then compound upon themselves and can influence the presidential election. So I'm glad that you just brought that up. We have another question. I'm curious about this too. What was the influence, if any, of General Grant upon the election? Did he get involved in kind of the top-down coercion, intimidation, politicization, or was he kind of more removed from that? What do we know about his involvement?
With Grant and Sherman, I'll throw in, Sherman especially did not want soldiers to be sent home and furloughed because he wanted the men in the field. And my recollection is that Grant wanted the soldiers in the field as well. But Grant's a fairly conservative guy, but he wanted, he was supportive of Lincoln's reelection and was willing to support allowing men to be furloughed home to vote. Sherman took a little more cajoling to get him to go along with it. But Grant had to approve some of the more drastic punishments. Like if someone's going to be sentenced to be executed, the commanding general is at times going to be involved in having to approve that. Now, I should say men were not sentenced to be executed for speech against Lincoln, although there were men who were sentenced to be executed for deserting when their excuse for desertion was they're not going to fight in an abolition war. So when you get cases like that, they're going to rise to the level of the general commanding the army where they are. I don't remember specifically. It's been a little while since I've looked at those records if Grant intervened in any of those specific cases, but I do recall him, approving the furloughs and being willing to do that to help get men home to vote for Lincoln. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. This is a question that I personally don't know which direction you are going to go with the answer for this. So I'm curious. Can you comment on the replacement of Hannibal Hamlin with Andrew Johnson as the vice presidential candidate? In your opinion, was this necessary to secure a victory? did it help secure soldiers' votes? And if it did, then why? So a three-part question.
In the end, I don't think it was necessary to secure Lincoln's victory. But I think in June of 1864, when Lincoln is nominated for president, when things are looking bad with the Overland campaign and 50, 60,000 casualties in that month alone, the Republicans are trying to think about ways to broaden their appeal. And so they decide to dump Hamlin, who's seen as more of an abolitionist from Maine, and to pick up Andrew Johnson, who's a war Democrat from Tennessee. And I think that, it's unclear how much Lincoln was involved in that decision, although I think Lincoln was somewhat involved. In the 1890s, there was a debate between John Nicolay, Lincoln's private secretary on the one hand, and then Alexander Kelly McClure and Ward Hill Lamon on the other hand. McClure was from your part of Pennsylvania. He was from near Adams County, I think. They debated how much Lincoln was involved. And my hunch is that Lincoln was supportive of this change because he wanted to broaden the appeal of the party. And I can't remember if I just said this, but I showed everyone the ballots at the beginning, and I pointed out the top, they said Union Party rather than Republican. I mean, one of the things that they did in that election was bring in a war Democrat as a running mate, and then change their name for that election to the Union Party. And that's a way to get Democrats to support you, including Democratic soldiers. One of the most interesting things about Andrew Johnson in this election is that not only is he the vice presidential candidate for the Union ticket, but he's also the governor, the military governor of Tennessee. And the election is held in Tennessee because, again, Tennessee is under Lincoln's Reconstruction, and they want to count the electoral votes, although they don't ultimately count. And Andrew Johnson requires a oath of allegiance of any voter in Tennessee. And one of the provisions of that oath is that you have to swear not to support an armistice for a negotiation of peace. And what's funny about that is the Democratic Party platform in 1864 explicitly called for an armistice for a negotiation of peace. And so Andrew Johnson was basically saying, hey, if you want to vote in Tennessee, you're not allowed to vote Democratic because you can't swear to oppose armistices and then vote for a platform that is calling for one. And a lot of people raised cackles about that, wrote to Lincoln and complained that Johnson was only allowing Union Party people to vote, no Democratic votes in Tennessee.
Huh. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, renaming the ballot or the party to the Union Party, I think is fascinating. It reminds me of Michael Woods's book about emotions and the sectional conflict. Union, obviously that word was so loaded to 19th century Americans in a way that we can't fully understand today, but just seeing that word elicited all kinds of emotions. And, if you were on the fence, if you see that word union, that's gonna, stoke those emotions to be all for that party, especially if it's, pits that choice against one that's considered morally repugnant just because it has to be the opposite of union. And obviously emotions swayed politics deeply for soldiers as well as 19th century civilians in general. So smart choice.
Michael Holt wrote an article years ago, Michael Holt from UVA, where he argued that what Lincoln wanted to do was actually create a new party and ditch the Republican label and have this new sort of umbrella big tent that would bring in the war Democratic folks. I don't know that I fully buy it, but I think it's interesting to think about whether or not some Republican leaders were thinking about not just a temporary rebranding, but a new political alignment. Sure.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I'm just looking to see if we have any more new questions. I think that's it from our folks, which is actually good for our timing because we're a little bit over. But John, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I think this was a really neat way to kick off some new programming, especially on the eve of Lincoln's birthday. Talking about, I think when we think about this, is another point that Pete and I were talking about with Andy in his book a couple of weeks ago. The idea of democracy in America, I think we want it to be nice and pure and simple. It's an all or nothing deal. It's either 100% good and pure, or it doesn't exist. And
Right.
you know what you show with your work is, you know, back then and now, we can celebrate a lot about democracy and the democratic process while also finding its flaws and the ways that it's impure and imperfect, and in some ways not clean.
Right. It's messy
as well. Yeah. Which is, you know, it's fascinating, but I think it's important perspective, you know, coming out of all of the events that we're dealing with now, and how we frame those in historical context. Again, not drawing in any way apples to oranges comparisons, but getting some perspective. So I really appreciate that. And I thank you for spending the evening with us and for kicking off this year's new programming. And for those of you who are watching, thank you all for spending your Thursday night with us. And do check back with us. Either you can follow us on Facebook, you can check out our website. Unfortunately, I tried to upload our nice logo and our website address to the background for tonight's image, for tonight's program, and unfortunately found that we have to upgrade and purchase a new program for StreamYard in order to have that feature. So I can't flash it on the screen, but it is on our website. It's on our Facebook page. Certainly, we'd love to see you at any of our Lincoln Fellowship events. Dedication Day in Soldiers National Cemetery, November 19th. Hopefully, we'll be back in person doing that this year, as well as 100 nights of taps during the summer in the cemetery. And of course, check back with us for future programming throughout the year as we talk about some other aspects of Lincoln and his presidency and that legacy. So thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you again, John, for a really great discussion. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.